All right.
Okay, it is 3:30 on Monday, so it must be legal update time. And today we're going to do a little bit of contracts, and we're going to go over 4 of the agreements that get prepared in conjunction with the purchase agreement, and are a problem if they don't. If you go back later and ask for any of these things that you didn't do originally, they can say no, and then your client's not going to be happy. So let me share my screen. Share this over here. Okay. We are okay, we're going to start with the SPRP, seller purchase of replacement property. All of the letters don't make sense, but this one does. So there's a couple things we need to talk about. So you've got a seller, you got a listing agreement, but the seller says he doesn't want to move unless he can find a replacement property. So you write that down on your listing agreement, and then you remember when you get an offer that your seller needs to sell his property. So you want to make sure that you put that in your counteroffer. To you're going to need to counter with this. That it's contingent on the seller purchase of replacement property. You're going to use this form. Okay, so notice it usually says it says I just circled this because it says it's an addendum to the purchase agreement or the counteroffer. Don't spend like 5 seconds thinking of which one of those you should do. It doesn't matter. Everything's an addendum to the RPA as far as I'm concerned. If you're attaching it to a counteroffer, that's fine to check counteroffer, but not worth thinking about or asking somebody. Okay. So this document has 2 contingencies for the seller, not 1, but 2. Okay. First one is for finding replacement property. Okay. It is contingent on you locating and getting your offer accepted on a replacement property. Okay. Or you may, at this point, by the time you're making offers, already have your property in escrow. Okay. So then you would check B, seller has entered into a contract to acquire replacement property already. And so then you don't need a contingency for finding replacement property because you have already found it. Okay. I've seen people not give this one because the seller thought that they found what they wanted and then maybe they didn't get their offer accepted or something happened. And so they didn't have a contingency, they weren't in escrow at the time, but they were so sure they were going to be that they didn't include this contingency, and it's not a good idea, right? Because what the worst that could happen is you don't need it, right? Okay, so B would be if you are already in escrow, you can't have a contingency for something that's already passed, right? Okay, so then there's C, close of replacement property. Now notice, because these forms are all just a little bit different, so you really have to pay attention to every one. There's one where they put everything together in A, and then you only check it down here if you're only using one of them. So, but this one, in addition to A, you have to check C. Okay, so it's A or B and C, close of replacement property. You do not want to be the one who forgot to give your seller a contingency for the close of the property. Okay, so you're going to check close of, so my seller is just found this property he loves. Now he wants to, he got a good offer. Now he wants to find a replacement property. He's just going out to look. We need a finding replacement property and we need a close. Okay. Unless for any reason the seller says, I don't need to close first. Once I've identified it, I have plenty of things I can do in between, something like that. But, okay. You could still give the contingency. You could always not use it, right? Okay, so now we get to time periods. And again, there's a lot of agreements that have these 2 paragraphs, but they all, or not all, but some of them default differently. So you can't assume you know what this is going to say before. So time periods for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, all time periods in the contract either begin the day after seller delivers to buyer removal of the finding replacement contingency. I found my property. Now, buyer, you start doing your stuff. Because if I never find my property, buyer doesn't need to do a home inspection or anything, right? Because there could be. So I'm for that, this one defaults into after the buyer removes the finding replacement contingency. And I go for that one, no matter which side I'm on, because it does seem fair, right? The other choice is remain as specified in the agreement. And when they're talking about the agreement, they're talking about the agreement where seller is selling. So you could do that if you want this buyer to get going right now and you don't, none of this, you're going to wait, you're going to be ready to go, then you would check the box. Okay. There's always two, one for time periods and one for deposits. So the second one is buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within 3 business days after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property. No, right? If you have the seller, oh, wait a minute, buyer's deposit shall be delivered. You want the buyer's deposit in escrow now, right? Because if you don't find replacement property, they get it back. But you need them to be, if they don't have a deposit, they're out looking for other houses still, right? Because you have a contingency and they have nothing to lose if they cancel, nothing. So you definitely want the deposit in escrow. And I don't like that it defaults to the opposite. You definitely want the deposit in escrow as specified in the agreement 3 days after we sign the RPA.
And actually, Cindy, escrow isn't even officially open until they have the EMD.
Right, that's true. They won't send out escrow instructions, right?
Yep.
So yeah, we need we really do need the EMD right away, and that should always be checked, even whether you have the buyer or the seller. If you're even the buyer, that's good faith. You know, it doesn't matter which side you're on. I think on both of these, it's kind of the right things to do. But you have to read it and see how it comes out and what it defaults to, because you're going to see in the next document, it defaults the opposite. So, okay. So this one got 3 stars for me. This is the Cindy 3-star thing, because it's one of my favorite things in any document we have. This says parties agree that seller may extend the close of escrow date so many days by providing buyer with written notice. Gosh, nobody cares about this in this particular document usually. And this is a place to give our seller a little leeway here. You know, so why not fill it in? Even if they counter it out, it's still, you have nothing to lose. And I think I've only seen this countered once, but I don't look at every counter offer. So, okay, so the seller's part, so you would, a maximum of, I don't know, 10 days. Maybe seller's going to need more 10 days. I found a property, we're closing escrow concurrently, but I want 10 days to move. So, gee, whatever. But I just think you should always give your seller that. That's why I like that one. And that's it. This is one of the shorter agreements, right? The seller purchase of replacement property. All we need to know is what are the contingency timelines.
I have a question with that.
Yes.
Okay, so if I'm representing the seller and then the buyer comes along and they put in a deposit, does their time start ticking for when they need to?
No, that's why they put the time periods for an inspection separate than buyer's deposit.
So everything will be.
So you could say this one is only after I remove my contingency, and this one I want right now.
Oh, I got it. Okay.
They put them in separate paragraphs in all the documents that have these. So
Okay, now I get it.
Right,
Okay.
because and for the very reason that I assume everyone does what I just said, right? It's we don't care so much for inspections, but we got to have the deposit.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, we're going on to the contingency for sale of buyer's property, which used to be a little 1-pager and now is a 1.5-page document with a lot more stuff in it. Okay, so there's some important stuff in here and there's, just stuff. Okay, the top is the top. Okay. Okay, so this one, the contingency for for sale of buyer's property in the RPA at paragraph 3L8, which is the very last under contingencies, the very last one, there's a box to check if you're the buyer and it's contingent on selling your property, and it will bring up this form. If you don't check the box, but you include the form with somewhere else, you write it on there, which I see a lot where people miss the boxes, but write it on. It's okay too, but that's all you have to do is check 3L8. And it says buyer has a contingency for selling for a sale of buyer's property, and it attaches this. Okay. So again, we have two contingencies. Okay, but this one, if you check A, you get them both. And if you don't want them both, then you would check B or C and just pick one. So one is for entering into a contract to sell buyer's property, and the other one is for closing escrow on buyer's property. Okay. And if you're already in escrow, maybe buyer's already in escrow on the sale of their property, then they can check C, only the close of escrow. That's all I need. Because if I'm already in escrow, I don't, you can't have a contingency for something you already did. I think, yeah, like I said. Okay, so again, two contingencies are possible. Maybe a buyer already, got their property into escrow before they decided to go make an offer. I don't know. But if you need both, then you don't check anything up here. A defaults to both for the sale and closing on buyer's property. And it tells you you have to fill out paragraphs 2 and 4. If you only want, and I saw one of these recently, a contract only to enter into the sale of buyer's property. Apparently they didn't need the money, but they wanted to make sure they'd sell it. Then you would only fill out paragraph 2 and not 4. And if you're only closing escrow, you would fill out 4, but not 2. But let's assume we're doing both. Okay. Buyer entering into a contract, it defaults to 17 days to get into contract to sell your property. Buyer. We went through a period where that was very, very, very doable. And we went through a period where it wasn't so doable. And now we're, I don't know, maybe somewhere in between, depending on the property. So anyway, it defaults to 17. Buyers filling this out, buyer can change that. Seller should be aware of these contingency periods. Okay, so paragraph 2B, and I'm only even going to say this because I recently had an agent that long time practice didn't know this, but whatever amount of days this is, 17 days, at the end of 17 days, the buyer is supposed to either remove the contingency or cancel. Okay, but as you and I both know, neither one usually happens. And so they keep that contingency until either they remove it or we cancel the contract. They will have a contingency to enter into contract for sale of their property. Okay. If buyer already has a listing agreement, they want to know who you're listing with, that kind of stuff. And yeah. Okay. Number 4, close of escrow buyer's property. Okay. So buyer has the following time. So this is now we're the seller, right? We're selling our property to this buyer who has to sell their property first. And the close of escrow, the two choices to me are not great. Okay. Buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. The scheduled close of escrow of seller's property, meaning this property. Meaning if I take this option, which is the default option, buyer has until our close of escrow date in order to sell their property. So obviously if they sell their property and they need the money, we're not closing on time because it takes maybe another day or 2 to close for us once the money gets transferred. But that's what it says. Buyer, you get this contingency right up till our closing date. Or you could check the box and you could say, no, I need you, buyer, to close escrow before our closing date so we know it's done. So it defaults to no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow date, but you could write in anything you want. But again, you keep thinking about it. We are in escrow already. They haven't even got a buyer yet. So the chances, the close of escrow date, the chances of it being before ours is probably a little bit like slim and none, right? Because they don't even have a buyer yet. I mean, a buyer yet. So, but anyway, this is an important contingency because, you can't cancel unless your contingency date passes. Okay. Number 5, status. It basically says that we have to keep the seller informed if we get into escrow and it falls out, if anything happens. But no earlier than the applicable date to remove contingencies, buyer shall deliver seller evidence. Okay. Oh, buyer and seller shall deliver evidence of the removal of those contingencies, right? So they're supposed to, here's my purchase agreement. Here's my listing agreement. This is where I'm in escrow. You're supposed to, you have to keep the seller. And of course you want to, because the seller, you don't want the seller to cancel. Okay. If it cancels, you have to tell the seller within 2 days. It should be like 2 hours, I think, but okay. Okay, backup offers and seller's right to require, okay. This is a super important paragraph that a lot of people don't seem to understand. But again, this, if you are the buyer, this is going to affect your buyer in a major way. So you better understand what you're agreeing to, okay? So the rule here under removal of buyer's contingency says that if the seller accepts a written backup offer, they can give the buyer a notice in writing to remove their contingency for closing escrow, whatever contingencies they have to find a buyer or close escrow. They have to remove their contingencies, remove the loan contingency, provide a verification of funds to close escrow without the sale of their property. That's the hard part. Okay, so if this, let's just say we get into escrow, we're doing this, we put our property on the market, we had a really nice open house yesterday, we think offers are coming in today, and we get a notice from seller that says, sorry, we accepted a backup offer. You have 2 days to show us proof of funds to close without your property closing, or we're gonna take the backup offer. Yikes, nobody wants that, okay? So that's what B says. But then we get down to C, and it's time to give the notice to remove contingencies. Okay, so it defaults to seller can give that notice right away. They get a backup offer tomorrow, you're gonna have to show proof of funds to close. Okay, then it gives delayed right to notify buyer no earlier than 17 days, or you could write something else in after acceptance. So buyer, I'm going to give you 17 days. We're going to see where you are first, but then if I get a backup offer, I have the right to take it if you can't show proof of funds to close and all that other stuff. So that's probably the better option for buyer, because it's probably one that seller will buy, even if you maybe change the 17 to 20 or 25. But if you check, see the bottom one, 3, no right to notify buyer. Seller never has a right to tell you if they get a backup offer that you have to show proof of funds. Yuck. No seller is going to go for that. I would hope as a seller's agent, you would not like that one. You might give them a delayed right, give them a chance to see where they get. Maybe in 17 days, they'll be in escrow and they'll have a short closing. Who knows, right? But no right is you're not protecting your seller if you check number 3. So yeah, something in between. But this has to get filled out correctly, or again, you might not protect your seller. If you just leave it, you say, well, I don't know what I want to put here, so I'm just going to leave this blank. Gosh, it defaults to they can give notice right away. You're not going to like that if they give the notice. Okay, removal of contingencies. They can only be removed in writing. Seller performs all actions, and 7B seller retains the right to cancel under paragraph 9. Right. Okay. Okay. Seller right to cancel and buyer right to cancel. This is all stuff you already know. The seller can cancel if the buyer has a duty and they give a notice to perform and they don't do it, then they can cancel. You know, it's all the different duties of buyer. They have to give a notice to perform before they can cancel, and then same thing with seller. If buyer fails to deliver their evidence, then the seller has to give one. But this is seller's right to cancel. I was going to say these are seller things. These are seller's right to cancel if buyer doesn't do what they're supposed to do. Same thing with buyer. If buyer's right to cancel, they have a contingency. If they can't enter into a contract, they have a right to cancel and get their deposit back in the time frame. Well, or at any time. Either party for buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel the contract for purchase of buyer's property. Buyer has a right to cancel. Buyer is unable to close escrow with the time specified in paragraph 4B, then buyer again has the right, if buyer's right to cancel, has the right to cancel. So it's all the usual reasons. I'm not exactly sure why they set them forth here, because it's nothing weird or different. Okay. Now we get to this paragraph. They stick it way in here at the end on this one, the time for performance. I'd have put it up higher if I was doing this. This is the same paragraph we just talked about, only in this time it defaults the other way. Time periods for inspections, contingencies, and other obligations shall begin as specified in the agreement. The other one, as you'll recall, they begin once the seller removes their contingency. So this time it defaults to the other way around. as set forth. So again, if you represent the buyer, other than deposit, if you represent the buyer and you don't want to do all this till you know if you can sell your property's not in escrow yet. You want to first make sure you can get into escrow, then you're going to check the day after buyer delivers escrow evidence that they're in escrow. Okay. So if you're the buyer, you might want to check this. I don't know if sellers would balk at it. I don't think so. I think it's the same thing. There's really no point. Now, the difference is the other one, the seller is the one who needs to do something. And now it's the buyer. So maybe the seller says, well, too bad, just because you want to do it doesn't mean we shouldn't start right now. So anyway, this is something you have to discuss with your client, but you should be able to explain to them, what the difference and why. Buyer's deposit, again, separate paragraph. It also, this time it defaults to delivered to escrow in the time in the agreement. So we won't probably touch that one to anybody, but obviously somebody could check within 3 days after. So that's why when you look at these, probably no one uses these often enough to memorize all of the little pieces here. So you have to read this paragraph through whenever you see one like this, because they don't all default to the same thing. I think that's terrible, frankly, but it's just the way it is. Okay. If you're the seller and the buyer didn't remove the contingencies and provide proof of funds. So now we've given our notice that we have a backup offer and the buyer didn't do it. This is where the seller can give, this is where the seller gives the notice right here. You don't have to use a separate form. Seller gives notice to buyer to remove buyer's property contingency, remove the loan contingency, provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. So if you're seller, if you want to give this notice, this is where you give it. You could put it, I'm sure, on a contingency removal as well, but it works here. So that is the contingency. If you get if you don't use these very often and you either have to draft one or you've gotten one from someone else, fill it out and send me something you get from someone else and I'll tell you what it says. I'll just come back and say, hey, this is what if you sign this, this is what you're agreeing to. You go, oh yeah, that's everything we want. We're perfect. Or no, I don't want that. What should I do? So yeah, be happy to review these when you get them or when you fill them out and let you know what it says so that you can decide if it says what you think it says. Because I know people don't use these forms that much and they're a little bit confusing. Okay. The seller license to remain in possession. So now we're on seller counteroffers and our seller needs to stay after the close of escrow. And notice it's called not a lease, but a license. Okay, because in California, anything for 30 days or more is a lease and requires all lease disclosures. That's why they made this 29 days. I know I used to tell people, if you've been listening to me for years, I used to say, well, I would use it if it were 30 or 31 or 32. Oops. So that would require the disclosures. And again, if you're the landlord, meaning you're the buyer, you want to make sure that you don't do something that would require you to give disclosures, or you want to give those disclosures, because it doesn't matter that the seller lived in the house, you still are required for a 30-day or more lease to give disclosures. But this form is a nice short form. I think it's now a little bit over a page, but as opposed to the residential lease. Okay, so it's a license. It is intended to grant seller a license to remain in possession. Again, that's to avoid this being a lease that requires all of the lease. There's a lot of lease disclosures, as I'm sure you're aware. Okay. Okay, so we need a term. Obviously, we need to know seller can stay in possession for how many days. Okay, consideration. Okay. In consideration of seller agreeing to sell and buyer agreeing to sing, seller agrees to pay broker a non-refundable license fee specified in one, how much per day, okay? Or you could just do a total if you want to just do a total. Then it says seller shall deposit such funds with escrow holder prior to close of escrow, or such funds shall be withheld from seller's proceeds, okay? So these funds, by the paragraph, are coming out of seller's proceeds, or seller's gonna have to put in more funds if they're not getting sufficient proceeds, okay? Okay, so here we go for the check marks that get missed. At close of escrow, all consideration will be released to buyer. It defaults to that. So if nothing is checked, as soon as escrow closes, whatever, if seller's gonna say a month or even up to a month, all consideration is released to buyer. So I often see these where the seller reserves a month, but only wants to pay the per diem for the days they actually use. Okay, and if that were the case, then we didn't want the money released to buyer. Right now, we want to save it until after we know how many days that is and return the rest to the seller. Because get it back from buyer, good luck. Okay, so then we might want to check this box, held in escrow. So escrow is going to hold it. If seller vacates prior to the end of the term, no portion of the consideration will be returned to seller unless otherwise agreed. So if your agreement, and again, I see this a lot, is that they're going to stay, they're paying only for the days they use, we have to put that in somewhere because this is not going to happen here. Okay. Okay, late charge fee, you can charge a late charge fee if, but it only depends on if they're paying, you know, by the month, like if they're staying 3 months and every month they're paying, there would be a late charge fee. If this is a one-time, either at the close of escrow or at the end of the lease term, then we wouldn't really have this. Okay. Talks about whose obligations they are to do maintenance and utilities. You really got to do that. The only thing I really wanted to point out, because this agreement is this key safe, key another. This becomes amazingly a big point of contention too often, where the seller says, I'm not giving you keys, I'm staying 30 days. I'll give you keys when I leave. But the contract, the RPA says we give keys at closing. And the buyer will shove that in your face and say, nope, it says right here, I get the keys at closing. If you're doing a lease for more than 30 days, this is not in the SIP, you can check the box and it says that we're not giving you keys until the end of the term. And sometimes sellers have a real preference about this, right? Because they, you know, they maybe get that they're the tenant now and the buyer owns the property, but they don't want to give the keys. So if your seller's that kind of person, you need to make sure that you check that box, because otherwise it defaults to giving them the keys. Okay, the rest of it is you can't assign and sublet, insurance that, you know, buyer should have this. Okay, after the close of escrow, seller is no longer insuring the property. Buyer is insuring the property. A seller wants to insure, someone asked me this today, if they want to insure their own personal property, they can get a renter's policy. But someone asked me today if the seller could insure the property for the month they're staying. And the answer is no, you can't insure a property you don't own. I mean, if the seller could insure it for the month they're staying, what's in it for them not to burn it down and get the money? They can't, because they don't own the property. So they don't have any, you can't buy insurance on something that's not yours.
Indeed, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Is it required, where does it require that, for instance, if let's say I'm representing the seller, so then the buyer requires a security deposit from the seller, that's one. What is the rule? My next question is, when they're doing a final walkthrough, do they have to do a final walkthrough twice?
They don't have to, but it seems to make, I mean, if you're trying to be really right, the first walkthrough is to make sure everything was fixed.
Yeah.
If there were a lot of things to fix, or there was any chance that the property could be in a different condition, I would do it now, because if you wait until seller leaves, the buyer can blame seller and say you did this while you were a tenant and you have to fix it.
Right. And I'm saying is, so they would technically be doing two walkthrough.
Right. The buyer wants a walkthrough at the close of escrow.
Right.
Seller wants a walkthrough at when they leave to make sure they're not going to get charged for, you know, that it's all done and everything's good.
So we are going to ask for security.
Yeah, I think I don't see how you could kind of not have two. Do you agree, Terry? You have to have two, right?
Huh?
That's right. You pretty much have to go back through a second time, or
Right.
at least give some people that option. Or what other people have done many times is that when they're looking for the amount of, you know, per diem, per day expenses and things, they tack on a deposit on top of that if the people are going to stay in there. So they kind of try to protect themselves dollar-wise.
Yeah.
I think I skipped over 3C, which is delivery of possession fee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of one of those things where if you're only charging $250 a day, if you charge it by the day, it encourages the seller to get out of there quickly because they don't want to have to pay $250 for any more than they want. But an
Oh.
additional deposit in case they go out there with damages. You know, they took the couch out through the front door and tore out the door jamb or something. There are things that can happen.
I see. Okay.
But yeah, there is a place 3C to put the delivery of possession fee, and once again, held in escrow or released to buyer.
Yeah.
It defaults to release to buyer. Nobody wants their security deposit released to the buyer.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Good question, Tess.
Yes.
Okay. I am not gonna go over the residential lease after sale other than to say that we're on page 6 and it goes to page 21 and it's all the residential lease after sale and all the disclosures and it's a lot. 15 pages, right? So, and it's just like doing a lease. It is a lease actually. And again, if over 30 days, the state of California requires all these disclosures, that's why they're all here. I just want to point out one thing on here, because if you prepare this lease, residential lease, oh, I'm not doing it for this, but I want to point it out because it's attached down here, just because I want to show you this. Let's wait towards the bottom. Oh, we went too far, sorry. Yeah, this one. Okay, and they include here, just not. Yeah, the rent cap and just cause addendum because it's a lease, even though it's probably just, a short lease. But if you do a lease for a client, I'm going to say this a billion times because I just saw my third one in a row that didn't have it. You're representing a client and you're doing a lease. This is a form that kind of comes out with the lease, spits out with the ones that don't require anything but a signature. This form, if you represent the landlord and you have a single family residence or a condo, you have to check the box when you give them this form in the lease. And a lot of people just go through the end and think it's just sign, because I've seen 2 of these now where they didn't check the box. And if you don't check the box, you're not exempt from the Tenant Protection Act. So if you represent a landlord and you're doing a lease, and I'm not even just talking about a residential lease after sale, any kind of, lease, you make sure that you get that box checked when you send this to the tenant. Otherwise, your landlord's going to be subject to the Tenant Protection Act, and we do not want that. It's not horrible, but it's not as good as not being subject. Right. Okay, that was what I wanted to show that on the lease. Does anyone have any questions about any of those?
I
Okay.
have one quick thought in addition to what you said a minute ago.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that is these forms you don't fill out very often. And Cindy mentioned that a couple of minutes ago and things, and it would be better, and I'm not speaking for Cindy, but I'm just saying that it would be better if we were hit up ahead of time. If you have questions about it, if you're curious about whether you're checking the right box or leaving a box unchecked entirely or something, it's a lot easier to take care of on the front end than it is to undo or redo after the fact with amendments and everything. It's easy for you to just text message and shoot one of us a copy of what you did, and we can make recommendations that way and say, oh yeah, you forgot to do this, or you did a great job, whatever it is. And it's easier for you. And that's what we're here about, is trying to make it easier for you.
Yeah, and that goes not just for these 4 documents, but for, of course, any car forms or any document. But the ones like these, yeah, I mean, honestly, if you could just send it to someone and have them tell you what it says, wouldn't that be nice? So yeah, let's make sure that our clients are protected. And if anyone has any questions about these or anything, we're here.
Yep, we are.
Okay.
We'll be here all week, right, Robert?
Yes.
All
Thank you.
week long, and I can't thank the 2 of you enough for certainly being so on top of these types of things, because contracts is not my thing, and
Well,
so
it's okay. We don't answer questions about
so I greatly
Yeah, we do.
appreciate, when I'm talking to agents and whatnot, that I can just say, call Cindy, call Terry.
don't forget today's property tax day. Once I forgot.
No, you're right, it is.
The penalties are not pleasant, so make sure you get your property tax paid.
And your income taxes are due a week from today.
Oh, yeah, another 5 days.
So there you go.
So with that in mind, have a good day.
Thank
And
you.
if you've already done your
Thank
taxes, the
you.
good
Thank
news
you,
is
Terry.
real estate agents are going to be off the rest of the week trying to figure out their taxes. What a great time to prospect.
That's true.
Yes.